do this in English. My Greek is still not good enough, but I hope everybody understands. We would like to thank EK Magazine for inviting us here. We were in some way surprised to be invited for the topic of color because we don't necessarily see our work in that sense. Nevertheless, we've chosen a few projects that use color, not necessarily as a decorative element, but in a way as an element that uses color as a tool for spatial enhancement or different kind of atmospheric feeling. Before we do that, we thought we'd go back a little bit in history. On the one hand, for us to understand a bit the application of color, how it has evolved over time, and also to maybe build a small bridge to our work. It's definitely incomplete, and we promise to be brief. So we're starting way in the beginning. In contrast to a general conception, color is applied also in ancient times. In this sense, as it is now known, buildings at that time were a descriptive element, so they were somehow in the same way as a contemporary comic. They were used as an element for people to be informed, to be educated. And that way they were also or polychromatic. So they were places that people could go and understand the stories that were being told in a literal way and a graphic and colored way. This was then later, let's say, proven. There was the knowledge of that, but it took a long time to understand that this was really the case. And from that knowledge, people could relate to these stories that were given in the past. Nevertheless, with the introduction of the printing press, this aspect of building, so being a descriptive element, describing stories over time, gradually vanished from the buildings, meaning that the stories were then being told suddenly in books, and the descriptive part of buildings vanished, and so did the color in some way. This is a gradual process over many centuries, so I'm not skipping every moment. And eventually that led to sort of an idolization of whiteness, which was in a way a misconception, as the color was always something omnipresent. But there was at some point a conviction that the whiteness was a purity, and everything that was colored was in a way a more vulgar or, let's say, uncultured way of representing architecture. Out of that came the translation, literally, and the stripping of ornament into something abstract that tried to take out entirely the color from the facade, and again the idolization of the whiteness, but at the same time still applying a certain amount of color in certain ways by creating optical illusions, as you see here with the ground floor still being painted green in order to give an emphasis to the floating aspect of the building. On the interior, in a similar way, from an abundance that was present before, this was then sort of through a process of in the context of industrialization and striving for hygiene, this was translated into a more abstract and more a relationship to primary colors that were in a way signaling certain areas in an interior. This was then taken to a further extreme in a sense that primary colors were identified as the absolute pure choice of colors that could be distributed throughout space and signal in a certain way certain aspects, almost like a literal zoning of areas and demarking of elements that were important. There were some other architects that were successful in applying materials that they had their own color in a colorful way that created that richness that was somehow a memory of the past with a mixture of a new and modern language of architecture. Nevertheless, out of that grew a certain resistance, you could say, being educated with, let's say, the principles of modernism, but still thinking of a pre-colonial time and trying to bring that as a merger into an architecture. In this example from Barragan, you see a merger of, let's say, Aztec, Mayan principles of application of colors with a primary volumetric composition of elements as in modernism. And so also in Greece, you could see that there was a certain resistance to the pure white and international approach to modern architecture and trying to find a way to merge these two worlds in a contextual way. In a similar way, also again in the more, let's say, equator or near areas, there was an emphasis on a very local idea of its own version of modern architecture, stressing, as an example here, the achievement of a structure, for example, as it was the highest span at its time. And as we go further in time, somehow the application of color and the use of it becomes somewhat diluted. It becomes a more of a manneristic aspect that somehow loses its strength and origin and also contextual relationship. And finally, culminating in this period, there was a sort of self-centered approach to application of colors that had very little to do with their immediate context. And as a reaction perhaps to that, in a different kind of context again, and perhaps more in relationship to the immediate cultural values of that context itself, there was an application of non-color. So in a way, seeing the gradient of gray tones as much as color as a literal color itself. And finally, sort of culminating in this idea that trying to represent something that is primary and abstract, but still in combination and contrast to the neoclassical context, we sort of have reached a situation of absolute whiteness again.
Θα συνεχίσω στα ελληνικά. Δεν τελείωσε. Χρησιμοποιούμε το χρώμα σαν εργαλείο στη δουλειά μας και ξεκινάμε από μια ιδέα του Μυρό, ότι το χρώμα είναι κάτι το οποίο είναι προσωπικό του καθενός, το πώς το ερμηνεύει, πώς το βλέπει, πώς το αισθάνεται. Εδώ προσπαθεί να δείξει το χρώμα των ονείρων του και προχωράμε σε μια κατηγοροποίηση των χρωμάτων. Ο τίτλος της διάλεξης μας έχει να κάνει με αυτή την κατηγοροποίηση και τα ράλ και έναν τρόπο επικοινωνίας και είναι ο τρόπος που πλέον χρησιμοποιούμε το χρώμα στη δουλειά μας. Ένα πολύ σημαντικό στοιχείο για μας είναι η ιδέα του φόντου και του αντικειμένου και πώς το χρώμα μπορεί να παίξει ένα ρόλο στο να δημιουργήσει αυτή τη δυναμική μεταξύ των δύο. Θέλοντας ή να τονίσουμε το αντικείμενο ή να τονίσουμε το φόντο και κάθε φορά αντιμετωπίζοντας το σε άλλη κλίμακα. Θα το δούμε σε κάποια παραδείγματα. Θα σας παρουσιάσουμε 4 έργα, τα οποία χρησιμοποιούν το χρώμα με μια διαφορετική στρατηγική κάθε φορά.
So, in this first project, as Κατερίνα was mentioning, the aspect of foreground and background is very important. And the focus of this project, it's a small bakery in central Athens, was the product itself, so bread and pastry, which in a way, for us from the beginning was the main focus, but at the same time, a mixture of this idea of foreground and background. So as much as the bread had to be in its foreground, the bakery itself, in the context of central Athens, was supposed to also be in the foreground. So we, from the beginning, thought, how can we respond to different ways of perception as one moves through the city, but also as one approaches literally the bread and sees it in immediate closeness. So first of all, the store itself has sort of a sign function that changes over time and becomes a billboard and a storefront and an attraction in itself. And as you approach this storefront, there's a usage of a sort of a white canvas where this storefront suddenly steps into the background, and the focus is with your visual field on the bread and the pastry itself. So suddenly the foreground becomes white, steps to the back, and the pastry in a way steps to the foreground. The application of this yellow tone was, let's say, not necessarily an obvious choice. It was in combination with many things, as building a contrast to the bread itself, but also to the building, the existing building, the green facade of the building. So in a way, to the interior and exterior, that it allowed for a certain datum to exist within the working spaces, but at the same time having all the installations sort of blend into one element and thereby letting them disappear. And again, from the outside, the storefront and the element of the store becoming an identifiable element within the city.
Θα συνεχίσουμε με ένα άλλο κατάστημα, τη Ζους Εντιών. Το συγκεκριμένο κατάστημα έχει ρούχα, άρα ο πρωταγωνιστής μας είναι το ύφασμα και το ρούχο, το οποίο αλλάζει χρώμα κάθε σεζόν και εμείς έπρεπε να προχωρήσουμε στο φόντο σαν παρέμβαση. Άρα φέρνουμε το ύφασμα μπροστά και η αρχιτεκτονική έρχεται και δημιουργεί ένα φόντο. Το φόντο αυτό μπορεί να φαίνεται άσπρο χρώμα, αλλά για μας ήταν κάτι φωτεινό και η έννοια της σκιάς ήταν πολύ σημαντική σε αυτό το έργο. Όλες οι επιφάνειες έχουν κάποια υλικότητα, ένα βάθος και έτσι υπάρχει ένα χρωματικό εύρος από άσπρο σε γκρι, το οποίο δημιουργεί το φόντο για τα ρούχα τα οποία αλλάζουν κάθε σεζόν. Και η ιδέα μας είναι ότι θα δημιουργήσουμε ένα φως, ένα φωτεινό φόντο, ώστε να προβάλλει το αντικείμενο το οποίο θέλουμε να προβληθεί. Και παρόλο που, όπως είπαμε και νωρίτερα, μιλάμε για χρώμα και το άσπρο χρώμα είναι, και γι' αυτό για μας είναι σημαντικό μέσα σε αυτή τη σειρά των έργων να μιλήσουμε και για το άσπρο.
The next project, this was about a temporary pavilion in the center of Athens. The idea was from the beginning how to produce a contrast that creates an identity in an immediate way. And in a sense, this project tries to create, again, the element itself, in this case, to the foreground, and the city itself becomes the background for the object itself. The idea to have a monochromatic element was highly important, so that it becomes almost like a silhouette within the city, that becomes a element that is uniform for every area. There's no focus on or no identification of a certain detail due to the monochromatic application. And within the context of the city itself, it becomes something that strikes out as strong as possible in a most simple way.
Και τέλος, θα μιλήσουμε για μια κατοικία εξοχική στην Τζιά, σε ένα τοπίο το οποίο είναι φυσικό και είναι το αντικείμενο στο οποίο πρέπει μέσα να παρέμβουμε. Η ιδέα εδώ ήταν να ενσωματωθούμε με το φόντο και την τοπογραφία. Τα υλικά που χρησιμοποίησαμε είναι μπετόν ανεπεξέργαστο, το οποίο επίσης έχει το δικό του χρώμα, το οποίο είναι ένα χρώμα το οποίο βλέπουμε σαν στοιχείο του τοπίου, μέσα από τα βράχια της περιοχής. Το χρώμα αυτό είναι και μέσα και έξω το ίδιο, μας δίνει την αίσθηση και την αμφισβήτηση του μέσα και του έξω, και ένα δάπεδο το οποίο είναι ενιαίο και χρωματικά τρέχει σε όλο το κτίσμα. Η ιδέα εδώ ήταν πάλι η χρήση του χρώματος, πιο πολύ σε υλικό παρά σε επεξεργασία πάνω από κάποιο υλικό, και την αφομοίωση με το φόντο μας και τα χρώματα αυτά να έρθουν και να ενσωματωθούν στο φόντο που δίνουμε. Άρα να μην έχουμε ένα αντικείμενο το οποίο χρησιμοποιεί χρώμα για να προβάλλει μπροστά από το φόντο. Και βοηθάει σε αυτή την ενιαία αίσθηση ενός χώρου, ο οποίος είναι μέσα, έξω, και τους ενδιάμεσους χώρους που έχουμε, που είναι μια ενδιάμεση κατάσταση εσωτερικού και εξωτερικού χώρου. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.